Karen called the cops over a truck in my OWN driveway. Wait till you see the shocker when she finds out who I really am. Face police. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings when the sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a soft, golden hue across the neighborhood. The world seemed to move at a slower pace, with only the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves breaking the serene silence. I had just returned home from a long shift, my mind still occupied with the responsibilities of the base I commanded. As the base commander, every day brought with it new challenges: managing personnel, overseeing operations, and making split-second decisions that affected the lives of the men and women who depended on me. But this morning, my attention was not on any of that. I was exhausted, ready to take a well-deserved break and enjoy the tranquility of my home for a few precious hours. I had parked my truck in the driveway, a bit askew, but no more so than usual. It was my driveway, after all, and I had parked there countless times without a problem. The driveway was wide, with more than enough space for a vehicle to pass through. But as I stood at the doorway of my garage, I noticed something strange. A figure was moving across the yard, walking briskly toward my truck. It was Karen. Karen had been a neighbor of mine for years, though I wouldn't exactly call her a friend. From the moment she moved in, she made her presence known, and not in a good way. It didn't take long for her to start her campaigns against anyone she deemed not up to her standards. No one was safe from her critical eye. If you dared to park slightly outside the lines of your driveway or let your lawn grow a tad too long, you could count on Karen to knock on your door with a complaint ready to go. Over the years, I had learned to ignore her little rants and to mind my own business. But that day, I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go in her quest for control. She was walking toward my truck now, and I could see her lips moving as she muttered to herself. Karen had this air about her, a sense of entitlement that could be felt from miles away. It wasn't just the way she held herself, but the way she believed the world should bend to her will. She didn't see herself as a mere homeowner in this community. No, she saw herself as the enforcer of rules, a self-appointed protector of order, which, in her mind, meant that everyone had to follow the standards she set in her own head. As I stepped outside, I heard her voice before I saw her. "You were blocking the driveway," she called out, her tone sharp, demanding. "You can just park like this. It's a hazard." I stood there for a moment, assessing the situation. My truck wasn't exactly in the center of the driveway, but it was far from being a serious obstruction. There was plenty of room for any car to pass by, even if it meant squeezing by the side of the truck. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, everything was a problem that needed to be fixed. She was the self-proclaimed sheriff of the neighborhood, and no small detail would escape her watchful eye. "I am just getting settled in," I replied calmly, trying to keep the situation as peaceful as possible. "I'll move it in a few minutes." But Karen wasn't having it. Her face flushed with indignation, and she pointed at the truck, her voice rising with each word. "No, you don't understand. You can just block your own driveway. You were going to cause an accident. I am going to call the authorities if you don't move it right now." At this point, I realized the full scope of what I was dealing with. Karen wasn't just upset that my truck was in a slightly awkward position. She was seizing the opportunity to push me into a corner. I could tell from the way she stood, hands on her hips, feet planted firmly on the ground, that she was preparing for a fight, one that she had clearly envisioned winning in her mind long before she even approached me. Now, I have dealt with my fair share of difficult people over the years, especially in my role as base commander. I've had to de-escalate tense situations, handle unruly personnel, and make high-stakes decisions that required quick thinking and calm under pressure. But nothing prepared me for this. I wasn't used to being the target of someone who seemed to have nothing better to do than micromanage my life. "Karen, this is my property," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and I am well within my rights to park my truck however I see fit. There's more than enough space for someone to drive past it, so there's no need to call the police." But she didn't listen. Karen wasn't interested in hearing reason. In her mind, she had already decided that I was in the wrong, and no explanation was going to change that. Her face twisted with frustration as she pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I am calling the police," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for me to hear. "You're breaking the law. I'll make you move it." I watched in disbelief as Karen began to tap furiously on her phone screen, making a scene in the middle of the neighborhood. At this point, I realized that the situation had escalated beyond just a minor inconvenience. This was no longer about parking. This was about power. She wanted to assert control. And I was the latest target in her endless crusade to make everyone else conform to her vision of the world. I took a deep breath, running through my options in my mind. I could move the truck, but I didn't want to give in to her demands, especially when I knew I had done nothing wrong. And I certainly didn't want to let Karen feel like she could just push me around with her petty complaints. But I also didn't want to make a scene that could drag out any longer than it had to. "Go ahead," I said. "Finally. Call the police. I'll be here when they arrive." As I said this, I could see Karen's eyes narrow. She hadn't expected me to be so calm, so unfazed. This was her moment, her chance to play the victim and drag me into her drama. But when I didn't react the way she expected, something shifted in her. She paused, her finger hovering over the call button, as if reconsidering her next move. But instead of backing down, she just pressed it anyway. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "ULLC." She stood there, phone pressed to her ear, waiting for the operator to pick up. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of disbelief. This was how far Karen was willing to go to prove a point. A simple misunderstanding had turned into a full-blown escalation. As I stood there, listening to her speak to the dispatcher, I realized that this wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about control. It was about a person who believed she had the power to dictate what others did with their own property. And at that moment, I knew I had to stand my ground. If I let her get away with this, she'd feel empowered to do the same thing to me, and to anyone else, at the drop of a hat. So, I waited. I waited for the inevitable call to the authorities. I waited for the drama to unfold. But I wasn't worried. I knew the rules, and I knew the law. And, more importantly, I knew that I wasn't the one in the wrong. As I stood there, watching Karen dial the phone, the absurdity of the situation hit me all over again. Here I was, standing on my own property, the place where I should have the most freedom to do as I pleased. Yet Karen had somehow managed to turn a simple parking issue into a full-blown crisis. I had barely parked my truck a few inches over the line, and now she was calling the police as if I had committed some grave offense. I could already see the scene unfolding in my mind. Karen, the self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer, laying out her version of events to the authorities, painting me as some sort of criminal. The phone rang in her hand, and I could see the gears in Karen's mind turning. She wasn't just calling to report a trivial parking issue. She was ready to make a statement, to be heard, to let the whole world know that she was the one who had brought order to this chaotic situation. She was making sure the police knew that she was in the right, that she was the victim of my alleged wrongdoing. I could practically hear her voice in my mind. "I am just trying to protect the neighborhood. This man is out of control. He's blocking the driveway, and who knows what else he might do if he gets away with it." I could only imagine the exaggerations she would throw in for good measure, painting herself as the heroic figure, the one who bravely took it upon herself to protect the community from me. She had always carried herself like she was the center of the universe, the one who had all the answers, the one who could do no wrong. And now, with the police on the way, she felt vindicated. She thought she had won. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I wasn't some neighbor she could bully into submission. I wasn't some hapless resident who could be manipulated by her petty demands. As the phone call dragged on, Karen's voice grew louder. I could hear her talking to the dispatcher, describing the situation, as though she were narrating the plot of a crime thriller. "Yes, I am at address. There's a truck blocking my neighbor's driveway. It's creating a hazard. I can even get to work because of this." The more she spoke, the more I could sense her sense of triumph. She was clearly enjoying the attention, relishing the power she thought she held in that moment. She was trying to make it sound like I was some reckless driver, blocking an emergency route, when in reality, I had parked in a perfectly reasonable spot that posed no danger to anyone. I could hear the calm voice of the dispatcher on the other end, asking Karen a few questions to get the details. Is the vehicle obstructing traffic? Is it blocking access to the road? Karen was quick to answer, but her responses were inconsistent. It's blocking the driveway, but I don't know if it's blocking traffic, she said, her voice unsure as she realized that the details she was providing didn't quite match the narrative she had been building in her head. But Karen didn't let that stop her. She wasn't concerned with accuracy. She just wanted to make sure that the authorities were on their way. She had a story to tell, and she was going to make sure it was heard. Meanwhile, I stood there, seething with frustration, but keeping my composure. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate the situation in her favor. This wasn't about the truck or the driveway anymore. This was about her trying to assert control over me and my property, using whatever means necessary, even if it meant involving the police in a completely trivial matter. I had been calm with her so far, but the more she escalated the situation, the more I realized that I needed to take a stand. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, not when I knew I had done nothing wrong. As Karen continued her call, I decided to take a few steps back. I knew that getting into a heated argument with her wasn't going to help matters. She was determined to be the victim, and no amount of reasoning was going to change that. Instead, I turned toward the front door and went inside. I wasn't running away. I was simply giving her space to vent. I knew she was the type of person who thrived on conflict, who needed the drama to fuel her sense of importance. By stepping away, I was denying her the satisfaction of seeing me get worked up. From inside the house, I could hear Karen's voice rise again, this time more insistent. She must have been describing the situation in more detail, adding layers of urgency to the narrative she was creating. Yes, officer, you need to come quickly. It's a major inconvenience. I rolled my eyes. The drama she was building was almost comical. But I knew this wasn't the time for humor. This wasn't a game. She was trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. A few moments later, I heard the sound of sirens approaching, growing louder with each passing second. Karen's victory was almost complete. She had made her call, and the police were on their way. At this point, I could have laughed at the absurdity of it all, but I remained calm. The officers were just doing their jobs, and I knew that once they arrived, they would see the situation for what it was. There was no reason to escalate things further. The only thing I had to do was stay patient and let the authorities handle it. The sirens grew louder still, and soon I saw the flashing lights of the police car in the driveway. Karen had done it. She had called the authorities on me. The car came to a stop in front of my house, and I could see the officer get out of the vehicle. He was a familiar face, someone I had worked with before in my capacity as base commander. We had crossed paths during several community outreach programs and knew each other well. As he walked toward the front door, his eyes met mine, and I could see a flicker of recognition. I opened the door, and the officer nodded in acknowledgement. Hey, there. What's going on? He asked, clearly puzzled. I could hear Karen's voice in the background, still trying to explain her side of the story. But I knew the officer wasn't going to buy her version of events. He had seen me around the neighborhood and knew the kind of person I was. He also knew Karen, and he wasn't a fan of her constant complaints. I greeted him calmly. Hey, thanks for coming. Karen here has decided to call you in because I parked my truck in my own driveway. The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression turning serious but not hostile. So, what's the issue? I motioned to my truck, which was parked slightly off-center in the driveway. There's no issue. I've parked here before, and there's plenty of space for anyone to get by. The officer nodded slowly, then turned to Karen, who had now gone silent. Realizing the futility of her actions, Karen was staring at the officer, a mix of frustration and disbelief on her face. She had expected a different outcome, one where I was chastised, or at the very least, told to move my truck. But this wasn't her show anymore. The officer was here to do his job, not to cater to Karen's petty grievances. The officer took a few steps toward the truck, examining the situation for himself. He glanced over at Karen, who was standing with her arms crossed, waiting for some form of justice to be served. He then looked back at me. "I don't see any problem here," he said calmly, his voice firm but not dismissive. "Your truck is parked on your property. There's plenty of room to pass." I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The situation was finally under control. Karen's hold on the narrative was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to change the outcome now. As the officer continued to speak with Karen, I remained at a distance, content to let the situation play itself out. For Karen, this was the ultimate humiliation. The story she had crafted, the one where I was the villain, had been dismantled in front of her very eyes. She had thought that calling the police would give her the power to control the situation. But in the end, it only exposed her for what she really was. Someone who was willing to go to extreme lengths to assert her authority, even when it wasn't justified. The officer, after a brief conversation with Karen, turned back to me. "You're good to go," he said. And with that, he turned to leave. I watched as he got back in his car and drove away, the sirens fading into the distance. And just like that, it was over. Karen had failed. As I stood there watching the officer approach, a wave of realization hit me like a tidal wave, and I could feel the corners of my mouth tugging into a barely contained smirk. Karen, completely oblivious to who she had just called the police on, stood with her arms crossed, an air of defiance still hanging on her every movement. She had always prided herself on being the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood rules, the person who knew exactly what was best for everyone, whether they wanted her advice or not. And yet, here she was, standing on the sidewalk, with no idea that the very person she had just tried to humiliate was someone far more important than she could have ever imagined. The officer, a calm but stern figure in his uniform, walked toward me with a look of recognition in his eyes. I had known him for years. Officer Stevens, a local law enforcement officer who had served in the community for as long as I could remember. But our relationship went beyond just being neighbors or casual acquaintances. I had worked closely with him in various community outreach programs, and we had crossed paths several times while serving together in different capacities. He knew who I was. More importantly, he knew what I did. As Stevens approached, I could see Karen stiffen. She had been so focused on her own indignation, so consumed with the idea of winning this little battle, that she hadn't even considered the possibility that the person she was so eager to punish wasn't just any ordinary neighbor. In fact, I wasn't even close to ordinary. I was the base commander for the local military base, a position of authority, leadership, and respect. I had spent years in uniform, earning the trust of my superiors, working alongside men and women who depended on my decisions to guide them through some of the most critical moments of their careers. And yet here I was, in the middle of my own neighborhood, a far cry from the tense, high-stakes operations I led at work. As the officer continued his approach, Karen still didn't seem to put two and two together. She was wrapped up in her own world, convinced that she was about to be proven right, that the police were finally going to do something about my reckless parking. She stood with her arms crossed tightly, looking straight at the officer as if she were the one to be respected. Her posture was rigid, almost as though she had already won, her victory lap already imagined in her mind. But as Officer Stevens stepped into the yard and greeted me, I could see the realization start to sink in. Ever so slowly, her eyes flicked back and forth between the officer and me, confusion clouding her face. At first, she didn't know how to react. She was used to controlling the narrative, used to being the center of attention, the one everyone had to listen to. But the moment Stevens looked me in the eyes and offered a polite nod of recognition, her world began to tilt. "Hey, sir." Officer Stevens greeted me with his usual professional tone, but there was a hint of warmth in his voice. "I didn't expect to see you here today." "Yeah, seems like my neighbors got a bit of a misunderstanding," I replied, gesturing toward Karen, who was now staring at me in stunned silence. The officer, never one to make things awkward, kept his tone polite and professional. What seems to be the problem? He asked, his eyes shifting to Karen, who now stood rigid with surprise, her arms dropping to her sides as if she had just realized the mistake she had made. Karen was still in shock. The words were stuck in her throat, unable to escape. She had never expected this, not in her wildest dreams. She had expected to call the police and get me into trouble. But instead, the officer was acknowledging me with the utmost respect, treating me with the kind of professionalism that she had expected to receive. She had wanted to feel powerful, to have the last word, to show the neighborhood that she was in control of her own little corner of the world. But now she stood before me, exposed. The mask she had so carefully crafted over the years was slowly slipping away. Is there a problem, ma'am? Officer Stevens asked Karen, his voice friendly but tinged with a hint of uncertainty. He wasn't accustomed to seeing his neighbors at odds, let alone in such a bizarre situation. But he knew me, and he knew Karen, and he wasn't one to be swayed by petty disputes. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. The usual fire that she wielded in her complaints was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Confusion, realization, and perhaps even a little bit of fear. Her eyes darted back and forth between me and Stevens, trying to piece together what was happening. She had called the police because she thought she was right. She had called the police because she thought that, as always, the rules were on her side. But now, faced with the reality of who I was, she couldn't quite bring herself to speak. Stevens gave her a moment to gather her thoughts before turning to me. So, what's going on? He asked. I nodded toward my truck, still parked exactly where I had left it. I am parked in my own driveway, I said calmly. I don't see the problem. Karen finally found her voice, though it was shaky and less certain than before. He's blocking the driveway, she stammered. He's causing a traffic hazard. No one can get through. Stevens, ever the professional, nodded and walked over to the truck, inspecting the situation. He took in the space, his eyes scanning the driveway and the street beyond. It was clear to anyone who looked that there was no real issue. The truck wasn't blocking the road, and there was more than enough room to pass by on either side. He turned back to Karen, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ma'am, he said politely, there's no issue here. This truck is parked in a private driveway. There's plenty of space to get by. Karen's face turned crimson, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She had expected Stevens to back her up, to validate her complaint and turn me into the villain of the story. But instead, he was telling her something entirely different, something that went against everything she had convinced herself was true. The air around her seemed to crackle with tension, and for a moment, she stood there like a deer caught in the headlights. I could see the cogs turning in her mind, the realization slowly dawning. She had messed up. She had gone too far this time. She had called the police on the wrong person. And now, she had no idea how to get out of the situation. The power she had thought she wielded was slipping from her grasp, and it was all happening right before her eyes. The officer, noticing her discomfort, continued to speak in a calm, almost reassuring tone. Look, I understand that sometimes it can be frustrating to have someone park in front of your driveway, but this is really not something that needs police involvement. Karen tried to salvage the situation, but her words were clumsy. Unsure. I just thought, she began, her voice trailing off. She didn't know how to explain herself, how to justify her actions. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she was in the right, and now she was floundering. I stood silently, letting her struggle, letting her wrestle with the embarrassment of realizing just how badly she had miscalculated. It wasn't about being cruel or enjoying her discomfort. It was about making sure that she understood that there were consequences to treating people this way. She couldn't just go around making complaints without understanding the full picture. She couldn't assume that she was always the authority, the one in control, without facing the reality of the situation. Finally, Karen looked at me, her face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. You were the base commander, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the realization had only just occurred to her. I didn't know. I didn't mean. No, you didn't. I replied, my voice steady but firm. You didn't mean any of it. You just didn't think. She stood there for a moment longer, processing the weight of the situation. I could see the shift in her demeanor, the way her shoulders slumped as the tension drained from her. She had come to assert her power over me. But instead, she had been put in her place. There was no more fight left in her, only the bitter taste of defeat. As Stevens wrapped up the conversation and walked back to his car, I could see Karen's pride, once so unshakable, crumbling before her. She had made a serious mistake. And now, she would have to live with the consequences. The air seemed to shift when Karen finally spoke, her voice wavering, betraying her usual self-assured tone. She had expected a quick resolution, a moment where the police officer would side with her, where she would be proven right and I would be forced to bend to her will. But that didn't happen. Instead, Karen found herself standing in the middle of her own public spectacle, a moment that she would likely never forget. The dramatic escalation she had orchestrated had fallen apart before her very eyes, and now she was left with nothing but the bitter sting of her own failure. Karen's gaze shifted between me and Officer Stevens, as if she was trying to piece together what had just happened. Her face flushed with embarrassment, her usual confidence now nowhere to be found. She had no idea how to navigate this. No one had ever stood up to her in such a way. No one had ever exposed her like this. Not in front of an officer. Not in front of the neighbors who had gathered around, eavesdropping on the unfolding scene. Stevens, ever the professional, took a step back and let the silence hang in the air for a moment. He knew the game was over, that Karen had lost any semblance of control she thought she had. But he wasn't there to make things worse for her. He was simply doing his job. He turned toward Karen, who was now visibly flustered, and with a calm yet firm tone, said, "Ma'am, I think it's clear that there's no issue here. You're free to go. But there's nothing more I can do for you." His words seemed to hit Karen like a ton of bricks. She had been so convinced that the officer's arrival would serve as her triumph, as a moment where the tables were turned and I was the one in trouble. Instead, it was the opposite. She was left with nothing but a bitter taste in her mouth, the echoes of her own wrongdoings reverberating louder than any complaint she had ever made. Still, Karen wasn't ready to back down. Her pride refused to let her surrender just yet. She had been humiliated in front of everyone. In front of Officer Stevens. In front of the neighbors. In front of the very community she had tried so hard to control. She wasn't about to let that stand without a fight, no matter how small or petty it seemed. "I am sorry," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Her words came out like a half-hearted attempt at diplomacy, but there was no conviction behind them. Karen was not used to apologizing. Apologies weren't in her vocabulary. For her, being right was everything, and admitting she was wrong was a defeat she wasn't prepared to face. But here she was, forced to offer the most reluctant apology I had ever heard. I stood there, my arms crossed, watching as Karen's face twisted with frustration. She couldn't bring herself to look me in the eye, instead focusing on the ground in front of her. She knew, deep down, that she had made a massive mistake, but she wasn't ready to accept it fully. She wanted to blame something, someone, anyone, other than herself. She wanted to twist the situation to make it seem like it wasn't really her fault. That was the Karen way. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she continued, though the words felt hollow. "I just thought, you just thought you could tell me what to do." I interjected, my voice firm but not unkind. "And when I didn't listen, you called the police, making it a public spectacle." My words hung in the air like an accusation, each one sharper than the last. I wasn't angry. No, this wasn't about anger. It was about setting a boundary, about making it clear that there were consequences to her actions. She couldn't just make a scene whenever things didn't go her way. Karen swallowed hard, her face reddening even more. She couldn't meet my gaze. Couldn't find the words to argue back. This wasn't a petty disagreement about a driveway anymore. This was about the realization that she had overstepped, that she had tried to wield power over someone who was not willing to bend to her whims. And now, in front of everyone, she was left to stew in the embarrassment of her own making. Stevens, sensing the tension in the air, decided to intervene. He had been a neutral presence in this whole affair, doing his job without picking sides. But he also knew the dynamics of the neighborhood. He had seen Karen in action before, and he knew this wouldn't be the first time she tried to assert her dominance. "Look, Karen," he said gently. "I understand that it's frustrating when things don't go as planned. But calling the police over something like this, that's not how we handle situations here." His tone was calm but pointed. "You're going to need to be more mindful of how you handle disagreements in the future." The weight of his words seemed to settle on her like a heavy blanket. And for a brief moment, Karen seemed to shrink. It was as if the reality of the situation finally hit her. She wasn't in control anymore. The illusion she had built around herself, the one where she was always right, where she could demand everyone else bend to her will, it cracked wide open. She had lost this time, and there was no getting that power back. Karen's next words were barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," she said, though it didn't sound like a true apology. It was more of a defensive statement, one meant to cover her tracks, to make it seem like she hadn't intentionally tried to ruin the moment for me. But there was no hiding the truth now. The people who had gathered to watch the drama unfold had already seen the reality. Karen had called the police over something as trivial as a parked car. And when the officer arrived, she realized that she had no real case. She had exposed herself for what she was. A petty neighbor with too much time on her hands and too much control in her own mind. I could hear the murmurs from the neighbors who had watched the whole ordeal. There were whispers of disbelief, and a few quiet chuckles as they realized how far Karen had gone to make a mountain out of a molehill. Karen's reputation had always been precarious. But this was the final straw. She had shown her true colors, and there was no coming back from it. She turned toward the group of neighbors, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. "I am sorry to everyone for making this a bigger deal than it needed to be," she said, though it was clear that the apology wasn't directed at them as much as it was at herself. Her voice lacked the sincerity it needed to feel genuine, and the crowd wasn't buying it. Some of them nodded politely, but there was no mistaking the look in their eyes. They saw her for who she really was. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction in the moment. I had no desire to see Karen humiliated, but I did want her to understand that her behavior had consequences. She couldn't keep bullying the neighborhood, making accusations without basis, and expecting to come out unscathed. She needed to learn that there were lines you simply didn't cross. Karen stood there for a moment longer, clearly struggling to save face. But as the reality of the situation sank in, she could no longer maintain the image she had built for so long. The power she had so eagerly sought was no longer hers to wield. The officer, who had been the neutral party in all of this, had done his part, and now it was over. There was no more to be said, no more drama to unfold. It was time for Karen to go back to her house and lick her wounds, to deal with the fallout of her own choices. As the officer walked back to his car, and as the neighbors slowly began to disperse, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. Not because I had won in some petty way, but because the balance had been restored. Karen had crossed a line, and now she would have to face the consequences. And in that moment, I knew that the community would no longer tolerate her antics. She had lost her grip on the neighborhood, and from here on out, it would be a little harder for her to walk around acting like the self-appointed ruler of the cul-de-sac. The days that followed Karen's public embarrassment were long ones for her. She tried to maintain her usual air of superiority, but it was impossible to ignore the ripple effect that her little stunt had created. It wasn't just the fact that she had tried to involve the police over something so trivial, though that alone would have been enough to make anyone question her judgment. It wasn't even the immediate fallout from the neighbors, who were all too aware of what had happened. No, what really stung Karen the most was the shift in perception. The community had seen her for who she truly was. A petty, self-righteous individual who was so obsessed with controlling the lives of others that she couldn't even comprehend the idea of leaving people alone. For weeks after that fateful morning, Karen walked around the neighborhood like a ghost, her usual smug smile replaced with a quiet, simmering resentment. She avoided eye contact with anyone, and when she did speak to neighbors, her voice lacked the usual confidence. She had lost something far more valuable than her dignity that day. She had lost her reputation. And she knew it. She wasn't the well-respected, self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood rules anymore. She was the woman who had caused a scene over a parked truck. The realization was enough to make her wish she could disappear. But the worst part, she couldn't. It was all out in the open now. And there was no way to undo what had been done. The other neighbors, who had once been wary of her constant complaints, were now more vocal about their own experiences. It was as if a floodgate had opened, and everyone suddenly felt the need to share their stories. I heard whispers in the mailroom, at the coffee shop, and in passing conversations on the street. Did you hear what Karen did the other day? They asked, with a knowing glance. She called the cops over a truck parked in a driveway. Even the most neutral of neighbors, those who had always avoided taking sides, couldn't help but join in the conversation. They had witnessed her meltdown firsthand, and they couldn't ignore the fact that she had become a symbol of everything they despised. It wasn't just about her behavior toward me. It was the fact that she had created chaos over something so small, so insignificant, and had tried to make herself out to be the hero in the process. As the days passed, the whispers only grew louder. It wasn't just the story of her failed attempt to control the situation that people remembered. It was the way she had humiliated herself in front of everyone. Karen had been caught red-handed in her own web of lies. She had been so sure of her righteousness, so convinced that her perspective was the only one that mattered, that she couldn't see the consequences of her actions. And now, she was reaping the fruits of that arrogance. What struck me the most during this period was how the community began to rally together. The neighbors, many of whom had been intimidated or simply too afraid to speak up in the past, now found themselves emboldened. There was a collective sense of relief in the air, as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for someone to finally call Karen out on her behavior. And when that moment came, when the police officer dismissed her complaints and walked away, it felt like a turning point for everyone. The dynamic in the neighborhood shifted, and for the first time in years, Karen was no longer the undisputed ruler of her own little domain. But while Karen was trying to figure out how to restore her reputation, I couldn't help but watch from the sidelines, seeing the changes unfold. She had never been a particularly friendly person, but now, her interactions with the rest of the neighborhood were marked by an unspoken distance. She was no longer the person people sought advice from or went to for help. No one trusted her anymore, and that was the price she paid for her actions. She tried to mend things by offering half-hearted apologies here and there, but the damage had already been done. The neighborhood's collective memory was long, and no matter how hard Karen tried to patch up the cracks in her reputation, she couldn't erase what had happened. She had turned herself into a cautionary tale. The woman who let her petty grievances spiral out of control and became the laughingstock of the community. I watched all of this with a certain sense of detachment. I wasn't interested in rubbing her face in it. After all, that wasn't the point. What mattered was that Karen had learned, or at least I hoped she had, that there were limits to what people would tolerate. She had spent so many years walking all over others, using her perceived authority to make everyone else bend to her will, that she never stopped to consider the fallout of her actions. Now she was seeing it firsthand. Still, even as her reputation began to crumble, Karen tried to salvage some semblance of control. She became more vocal in the neighborhood meetings, but her words were less convincing now. When she spoke, people listened, but not because they respected her opinion. No, they listened because they were waiting for the next mistake, the next misstep that would expose her for what she really was. And every time she opened her mouth, every time she tried to dominate the conversation, they saw the cracks in her facade. Karen's downfall wasn't just about the truck. It wasn't just about the police call. It was about her inability to realize that people weren't afraid of her anymore. She had built her reputation on intimidation, on playing the role of the neighborhood watchdog. But now that everyone knew what she was really like, a petty, self-absorbed woman who used others as pawns in her personal game of control, her influence evaporated. She had no leverage anymore. She had no authority. As the weeks went by, Karen's presence in the neighborhood became less and less noticeable. She no longer made her usual rounds, complaining about the way people kept their lawns or where they parked their cars. She wasn't the loudest voice in the neighborhood meetings anymore. And when she did speak, it was as if people were tuning her out, waiting for her to finish so they could move on to something else. The power dynamic had shifted, and Karen was no longer the center of attention. In many ways, she had become a relic of the past, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and a reminder that even the most self-righteous among us can fall. For me, watching her slowly fade into irrelevance was a bittersweet experience. I hadn't set out to make her a pariah, but I couldn't deny that there was a sense of satisfaction in seeing her face the consequences of her actions. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about reminding her, and everyone else, that there were limits to what one person could do in a community. You couldn't just impose your will on others without repercussions. In the end, Karen became a punchline. Whenever the topic of neighborhood disputes came up, someone would inevitably bring up the story of the time Karen called the police over a parked truck. It became the defining moment of her reputation, the event that everyone would remember whenever they thought of her. She had tried to make a scene, to get me in trouble, to assert her dominance over everyone else. But in the end, she had only succeeded in humiliating herself. And so, as the months passed, Karen faded into the background, a shadow of the figure she once was. She no longer had the same influence over the neighborhood. And though she continued to live in the same house, the energy around her had changed. People spoke about her in hushed tones, a mixture of pity and ridicule, but no longer with fear or respect. She had been brought down by her own arrogance and her inability to see the limits of her power. She never apologized for what she did. That would have been too much to ask. But in the silent glances exchanged between the neighbors, in the way people began to speak more freely, it was clear that the community had moved on. Karen, for all her bluster, was no longer the force she once was. The fallout from her actions had stripped her of the power she had once held so tightly. And now, she was just another face in the crowd, no different from anyone else. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing Karens get called out. Fire eyes.